Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmakers. I'm Casey Counts. Adult use cannabis sales began in New Mexico April 1st. On this edition, we'll take an inventory of the first month of the industry in the state. Our guest is New Mexico State Senator for District 38, Carrie Hamblen. Carrie is also president and CEO of the Las Cruces Green Chamber of Commerce. Senator Hamblen, thank you for taking some time with us.
Thank you so much, Casey, for letting me be here today. It's a pleasure to be able to be on Newsmakers and to be talking with you.
Well, New Mexico just marked 1 month of adult use cannabis sales. What can you tell us about the numbers at this point, and what are the other measures of success or failure this initial stage of the industry would show us?
Well, it certainly exceeded expectations, in Las Cruces, given that we are so close to Texas. We knew when the cannabis law was passed that border communities would benefit a great deal from the sales of cannabis. And, we saw within the first week several $1 million worth of sales. The rollout was actually smooth in comparison to other states. And I have to give credit to a lot of the legislatures, but also the Records and Licensing Department, because there's been so many conversations and commitment to making sure that this law addresses all the issues that we're seeing show up in other states. And so, the consistent buying pattern that showed up after sales became legal on April 1st, more than $25 million in sales to date. Patients were able and customers were able to get their products and medicine that they wanted and needed. And we can probably talk about whether or not there was a shortage of products. We'll be able to get to that. But, the adult use cannabis sales are expected to generate $300 million in sales annually and create 11,000 jobs, as well as bring in $50 million in state revenue. And according to the Records and Licensing Department, we are on track. So it's an exciting opportunity for our state, for an industry that we're going to benefit from.
Are you able to expand a little bit on some of those areas that you identified as maybe some of the mistakes that other states made that you used as a roadmap as we were designing policy in New Mexico?
I do want to give credit to Senator Katie Duhigg, who is one of my freshman colleagues, because when the cannabis legislation was drafted, there were so many conversations happening in the chambers, in committee meetings, with Linda Trujillo, who is the director of Records and Licensing, the superintendent of that, to make sure that we didn't have any of the mistakes. So there was a lot of plant counts and license limiting. I have to say, according to some articles, that New Mexico is actually a model now for how our records and licensing and licenses given do not discriminate against Black, Indigenous, Brown, people of color, LGBTQ, formerly incarcerated. We don't have those barriers for those communities, whereas other states do have those. We talk about social equity. And so that's one of the things that I think New Mexico is really leading and showing as an example and is being recognized elsewhere.
I definitely want to get back to the concept of social equity, but first, it seems like there was a bit of a misstep in terms of the state testing labs. There are 2 labs in the state, one in Albuquerque, one in Santa Fe, and that means issues for southern New Mexico growers. So what possible fixes are being discussed, and how are we going to get that situation sorted out?
So I found out the history of this after talking with both Records and Licensing and Ben Lewinger, the head of the New Mexico Cannabis Chamber. And so our issue is we used to have Rio Grande analytics in Las Cruces, but when cannabis became legal medically, a lot of their business was being done up in Albuquerque. And so they decided to move to Albuquerque. Well, then when it became legal for recreational use, all of a sudden we didn't have a lab. And so the product has to be tested for consistency. I believe I'm not that much of a connoisseur, so I don't know all the specifics, but they have to make sure that they can test it, that like tinctures are at the percentage that they say they are, that chocolates are at the percentage that they say they are. And so they're able to do that. But now all of a sudden, when it becomes adult use recreational, we don't have a lab down in southern New Mexico to be able to do that. And so, as you had mentioned, so what we've been told is that there are a few operators that are very close to opening south of the checkpoint, including a satellite location for Rio Grande Analytics. And so we expect that to happen in the first, operational by the end of the summer. So there is light at the end of the tunnel for that, because, and then what that does, so the problem is that for folks who may not know the nitty gritty, is that if you grow in southern New Mexico and want to sell your product, it still has to get tested first. But we have a Border Patrol checkpoint that makes it illegal to transfer that cannabis to get tested. And so we do know that Records and Licensing is talking with the Department of Homeland Security and the Border Patrol about workable solutions. So we should be seeing that information happening and moving ahead by the end of summer.
And is there any comment from Border Patrol in terms of how they'll handle these situations as they arise?
You know, I haven't got that information. I haven't had a conversation with Border Patrol, and I know Records and Licensing is doing that. You know, I think there are people probably who are taking it up to get tested right now and just not getting flagged of Border Patrol. But and part of it is like, it's legal. I think it might be all depending on how much they want to enforce those rules. And, for an industry that I think is going to be really beneficial for New Mexico, I'm not sure if they're going to be really sticklers on it right now. But we want to make sure that we have policies and laws in place to protect everybody who's doing that, and to make sure that those departments are all on board. So I feel confident that Records and Licensing is having good conversations with Homeland Security and Border Patrol to make sure that there's a solution that is beneficial and not putting anybody in danger.
And that goes for individuals as well, who are just traveling throughout the state, and whether they're medicinal users or using adult use cannabis in a non-medicinal way, they certainly are subject to the same federal law.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So we'll see. I do feel that, I think our Records and Licensing Department, in addressing any issues with cannabis, part of the thing that's been, I think, really upstanding in New Mexico is that legislators have known that we would address any issues that come up on a yearly basis. We're committed to doing that. Records and Licensing is working on creative solutions to make sure that we can support our BIPOC communities, that we can support micro growers, that we can support New Mexico owned businesses. And we'll get into like how many businesses are New Mexico owned. But I feel that the thing that sets us apart is that everybody's willing to come to the table and have those conversations, because we see that this is an opportunity to benefit our state, and we're tired of being last in things. And I think this is an opportunity for us to be first.
And another issue that, obviously it stands out for businesses that are operating in this industry is the banking issue and having to operate on a cash-only basis. What kinds of policy solutions do you think are necessary to move this business into a more traditional financial sense?
Well, it's not a cash-only business anymore, Casey. It's actually where there are dispensaries that will allow credit cards. I think what's happened is that the businesses have worked out arrangements to how that shows up on your credit card. But half a dozen banks are working with cannabis distributors and dispensaries to have accounts. Traditional lending from banks isn't available until federal decriminalization. But there are a number of banks that will open an account for a business. Matter of fact, in Las Cruces, First Financial Credit Union, they're planning on rolling out cannabis financial services this summer. And then, according to Ben Lewinger from the New Mexico Cannabis Chamber, there are banks that will lease you a safe. So this is a creative way, and this is why I love New Mexico. Will lease you a safe where you go put the counted money in the safe that's available to that business. So it's like you have your own little vault that is connected to the bank that only you have access to.
And what measures would you say were important for these businesses in terms of security, moving that money around as they got started?
Do you mean in terms of like moving the money from the dispensary to a banking institution?
Yeah, that just in terms of the dangers that are also posed, at the stores. Obviously, they're targeted.
Right. Well, I think them understanding the security issues, that was something that we could learn from other states. So, for example, up in Trinidad, they have a room that is separate from the actual sales room. So your license has to be checked. You have to be buzzed in. Now I know that in Las Cruces, there's a dispensary up off of Mall Drive that they have somebody who checks your ID when you walk in, before you walk in, and then you go through security bars, and then you are then interacting with the sales folks, with the bud tenders. But I think they've done that. I mean, we haven't had any reports of anybody getting broken into or held up at this time, and I hope that doesn't happen. But I think that they've taken the security measures with cameras and everything, so it would be a foolish move for somebody to try and do that.
The U.S. House passed a bill to decriminalize cannabis. That may not go anywhere. I don't think it's expected to. Is this a meaningful first step on a federal level, if it's a first step?
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting. When we look at how many states have legalized adult use cannabis, that's 18 states. Medical is legal in 38 states. We have to remember that the majority of states have some kind of legal cannabis program. Canada has legalized cannabis. Mexico is getting ready to legalize cannabis. Having this patchwork of states is not effective for us as a country to talk about being able to regulate and benefit from cannabis sales when it's still federally illegal. So, the fact that we have this conversation going on is important. It's national. It's important to keep that conversation moving forward. And, for the last 2 years, the majority of voters, including Republican voters, want legalized cannabis. So it's time. It's really time.
Just a few days ago, President Biden issued some of the first pardons of his presidency. They included 3 people who had been sentenced to long prison terms due to drug crimes. What are we seeing here in New Mexico in terms of reaching social justice regarding this issue?
So this is one of the things that really I was so proud of to be able to vote for in the legislature, was the expungement of records of people who were arrested for 2 ounces or less of possession. Typically, that is people who are arrested for 2 ounces or less are Black, brown, and indigenous men. They're deliberately targeted for that, because the thing is that we know that white men and white folks use cannabis, and yet we don't see the majority of them in jail for that possession. So, I think it's significant that we are focusing on that. The challenge is a software issue, according to Ben Lewinger from the New Mexico Chamber. So it's not simple to just select all from the 160,000 potential records that can be expunged. I did ask Victor Reyes from the Records and Licensing Department if he was able to find out in terms of the kind of the breakdown of that. And I don't have that information yet, but I would like to provide that, because I think it will be very telling what we see in terms of how many people are targeted for cannabis possession. But we need to be expunging 3,000 records a year. There's 160,000. The problem is that each of the individual district attorney's offices have been sent a list from the state to, these are the folks that we have that have been arrested. What has to happen is that the district attorney's office has to go through and make sure that there are not other charges connected with those, and then go through. So there's a lot of manual labor time in that. So it's not going as quickly as I'd like, because these folks have been incarcerated unfairly, and they're waiting. And there are folks who have had their records expunged, and they're like, wow, I had to serve 4 years for this. I understand the inequity of that. I do feel it's important that we continue moving forward and making sure that social justice element is there. But then also on the social equity is that, as I mentioned before, New Mexico has not had those barriers in place to allow BIPOC communities, formerly incarcerated women, to get licenses to go ahead and grow. New Mexico leads that. Oklahoma actually has no barriers to entry, which is really interesting. So New Mexico and Oklahoma are really leading that cause in terms of making sure that everybody has access to this opportunity, to the economic opportunities, that they're not going to get incarcerated for it, that people don't have to depend on big pharma for sleep, which is what I have. That's how I use cannabis, is because it helps me sleep as I've gotten older. Apparently insomnia is something that's happening, and thank goodness I don't have to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning anymore.
Well, I fully expect to soon become an insomniac, just as my mother did. So we'll see what happens. But it looks like the legislature worked really hard to kind of put their arms around social equity, what that meant and what it should look like in terms of policy. And so you can go to the Cannabis Control Division's website and read a lot about it. Was it time consuming to figure out how you were going to define everything along the way? Because obviously laying at the foundation of that is how you define social equity.
Well, you know, the thing is that this type of legislation has been several years in the works, but, you know, kept failing in the Senate. And so there's been a lot of work put into it. And I have to give a lot of credit to Representative Andrea Romero, who was really working on the expungement and the social justice element, Representative Javier Martinez, who also did some incredible work, and then Senator Katie Duhigg, who was the senator who was able to push it through in the Senate chambers. You know, but we've also had the benefit of learning from other states, and, you know, the conversation ever since it started was, we want to make sure that we do this right. We want to make sure that we learn from what other states are doing, and we know that New Mexico is a unique creature, and we're committed to coming back and making sure that, you know, we address those issues. And I have to say, Casey, you know, we tried to do that in this last session because there is a water issue. You know, when it comes down to it, we've got the acequias who are really worried about the water depletion for cannabis growing, and we tried to address that, and we tried to get that legislation passed, and unfortunately that legislation didn't pass. So I know it will be coming up again, because we are a state that is experiencing severe drought. We have crops that are huge water consumers that we export, and I have to say pecans is one of those. And it breaks my heart because it's part of our fabric of our state, you know, our cultural fabric, and yet it's also a really large water consumer. And we've got these acequias that are up north that are really worried about the water that they're going to be able to provide for small farmers. And so that attempt was we tried that, and it didn't pass, and so we'll bring it up again.
All right. Well, you mentioned New Mexico being unique, and Las Cruces in this picture is a little bit unique as well. Two firsts for Las Cruces, maybe one not so much on purpose. The first to sell adult use cannabis in the state at 12:01 a.m. on April 1st. An oversight by Las Cruces City Council by all accounts. Were local bodies well enough prepared to set regulations all around the state?
Well, I checked with Ben Lewinger, the executive director of the New Mexico Cannabis Chamber, and he actually said Las Cruces is leading when it comes down to looking at zoning and the operation of dispensaries. And this is a quote from him. He said, "The city of Las Cruces took this more seriously than anyone else in the state. They were the most proactive city to tackle the zoning issues. Everywhere else is disallowing outdoor consumption lounges, and that's what we have here as well. We have a consumption lounge." And he said, you know, Las Cruces is looking toward the future for consumption, really doing a great job of destigmatizing this plant that can generate and has generated millions already in the first month of sales. I have the utmost respect for our all-women city council. And I feel that, you know, the fact that they didn't send set operating hours is not necessarily that they were ill-informed. I think, like people at the state level and people here at the city level, everybody is committed to making sure that this works and that we address it on a regular basis. So if they want to go ahead and set it up like bar hours, I don't think that's going to be a bad thing. But, you know, it was a big deal. I mean, you know, one of our dispensaries, and full disclosure, it's a member of the Green Chamber, you know, they opened at 12:01 and they had 250 people outside. They did a great marketing plan and had 250 people outside their door at 12:01 a.m. on April 1st. And people were excited about it. And I think we can still do that. I've got a dispensary that's right around the corner down the street from me on Valley, and they were having a parking lot fair, and they had food trucks and live music. You know, it's going to be a lot of fun to see what they're doing and to see how creative they can be, but also making sure that, you know, we have an opportunity to diversify our revenue streams and our economic economy.
You mentioned the consumption lounge. That was the other first for Las Cruces that I was referring to. Do you anticipate, or has there already been pushback against a consumption lounge versus just an adult use cannabis store or dispensary?
You know, I would much rather have people consuming it in a small protected area than out in the city park. Because I can tell you that, like, shortly after it became legal, I was walking down Main Street and I could smell it. And I would much rather people be in their homes or in places that are designated as such rather than out in public, in all honesty, just because we've got children, we've got families that are around that don't have that control. So I think the idea of a consumption lounge is a great idea. I mean, I've talked about it before, even in the Senate and the legislature when it came before the Tax, Business, and Transportation Committee, is like, these are opportunities for economic development. Can you imagine? I mean, I'm thinking about this, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is like the different ways that we can start diversifying our revenue stream. You know, if we can have restaurants that have pairings, which we're not the first to do this. They do this in California, where they're cooking with cannabis and they're pairing and they're having an experience that people can come and enjoy. I think the consumption lounges are really kind of laying the foundation for that.
And you mentioned dispensaries in your neighborhood. There was a recent article in the Las Cruces Sun News about dispensaries moving into areas where maybe some time ago other businesses moved out. Are you seeing an opportunity for some of the more unused areas in our city to take advantage of this industry, and vice versa?
Yes, actually the place that is around the corner from me used to be a mechanic shop. It's on a major thoroughfare, and you know, I think we have this opportunity. You know, El Paseo, you know, the city of Las Cruces has been working really hard to try and make El Paseo not a stop, a shop and go, but a shop and stay, so that people are not just driving through, going to a place, but they're actually supporting a number of businesses. And I think we have an opportunity to do that, to revitalize El Paseo, because we're seeing a lot of vacancies on El Paseo, and I think this is a really good opportunity for that.
You mentioned our Greenleaf, the first to sell adult use cannabis. Their parent company is Schwazze. It's headquartered in Denver. Are you able to give us any idea of what numbers of new businesses are locally owned?
Yeah, so talking with the Records and Licensing Department, they certainly recognize that there are maybe a handful of outside businesses. But I'm going to give you a breakdown of the 653 licenses that they have issued to date. 94 manufacturer licenses, 125 producer licenses, 107 producer micro businesses, 241 cannabis retailers, 34 vertically integrated renewals. I'm not really sure what that means, but I'm sure it's something that's important, and 2 cannabis testing laboratories. So the thing is that they said yes, so we can recognize that there are some bigger organizations like Schwazze is kind of I guess we would consider it multinational, but I think one of the owners, when I talked with Victor Reyes, said that one of the owners may be, I think, from Canada. But he assured me that the majority of those licensees are New Mexicans, and you know, I feel comfortable with that, because I'm certainly one who talks about keeping money local so that it doesn't go to somebody else's pocketbook in another state.
All right.
So I think we're doing all right.
Well, let's get back to medicinal users. You mentioned earlier that we'd come back to this, and now we just have a couple of minutes left. So I want to address that. The medicinal patients did see a price increase. Was that related to supply, and how is this issue being addressed?
Well, according to Ben Lewinger, that we did not have there was this big kind of sky is falling that, oh, we're going to run out of product, you know, on the, you know, in the first week. What we saw is that, there isn't a supply shortage. And even something that I didn't know is that the plants that are being grown right now, we're going to see on the shelves in October. And we'll be able to see that. And what he said is that, you know, there is no supply shortage, that outdoor grow season products will be on the shelves in October. I went to our Greenleaf probably a week and a half after they opened, and there was a syrup that I used for insomnia that they didn't have. It doesn't mean that the product doesn't exist. It means that they just ran out of supply. So because there was a demand for it. But I think that we're finding that people are certainly still able to access and have the product they need.
All right, Carrie. Well, thank you so much. That's all the time that we have for today. So we hope to have you come back again soon. We can reevaluate the industry again with you and talk about other areas of economic development for our state. Senator Carrie Hamblen, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Casey.
And that's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday, morning edition, 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now from noon to 2, and All Things Considered from 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Casey Counts. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.